Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning once again to you all here. It's lovely to see so many of you here today, and some of you actually staying in from our last conversation into this morning's 11 o'clock presentation. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce another new addition to our conversation program. Now, Robin's actually going to stay with us now till Cape Town, aren't you, Robin? So he's going to stay with us all the way through. So we have a whole selection and array of conversations about the place we're about to visit, South Africa. So today, to give an introduction to this incredible nation, we're going to hand over to, well, a gentleman who knows it firsthand. So let's welcome to the stage the incredible Robin Binckes. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you very much, Ross. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm so delighted that you came to my talk instead of bridge tips. So thank you for being here. You know, doing these talks, I find absolutely terrifying. I do it for a living, but I'm always terrified. So I have a procedure, and that is to tell a joke before I start it.
Oh, careful.
I should have put more water with it this morning, but I start with a joke just to make myself feel a lot better. So with your permission, I'll do the same. You all remember 1969. A man called Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And when he walked on the moon, he uttered those words that have become immortal. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Well, what you might not know is that despite Neil Armstrong's extreme intelligence, he battled to remember those words. I mean, it was all choreographed and so on. And he'd have to rehearse one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and he'd get the words in the wrong sequence. He couldn't get it right. On the 19th of July of 1969, the day before blastoff, he got it right. And there was a great relief in Houston Mission Control. Off he blasted to the moon. And the world waited and watched. I'm sure you all did. And as he stepped out of that capsule, they all waited to hear the words, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And what they heard was, good luck, Mr. Zorski. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Well, there was chaos in Houston. And when Armstrong returned, of course, the media were all there, cameras flashing, televisions running. People shouting, what did you mean? When you walked on the moon, we distinctly heard you say, good luck, Mr. Gorski. Armstrong said, I can't tell you that, I'm afraid. It'll embarrass Mr. Gorski. Well, the years went by and people forgot about it. And Armstrong passed away, I think, about 10 years ago. And before he passed away, he gave a press conference a few years before. And the usual questions were asked, how was it when you walked on the moon? How did it feel to be the first man on the moon? Were you frightened? Etc. Then a little old guy at the back put up his arm and he said, Mr. Armstrong, he said, I distinctly remember that day when you walked on the moon. He said, just before you uttered those words that have become immortal, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, we all heard you say, good luck, Mr. Zorski. What did you mean by that? He said, I can tell you now. He said, you see, Mr. Zorski has passed on. But he said, when I was a kid, we didn't have much money. And we lived in a very poor neighborhood with obviously small properties, and our houses were cheek by jowl. And we lived next door to the Zorskis. And one day when I was a little boy, I was playing in the garden, and I heard the Zorskis having one hell of a row. And I heard Mrs. Zorski say to Mr. Zorski, 6, you want 6. You won't get 6 until the boy next door walks on the moon. So good luck, Mr. Zorski. So I'm proudly South African, and I'm going to hopefully fill in some of the little gaps. In fact, Daniel's talk, I see like a parchment. I'm going to hopefully paint some of the picture for you of this incredible country that I'm proud to be from and which you are going to be visiting shortly. So we are a nation of some 60 million people, and an area of South Africa of some 758,000 square miles, the 24th largest country in the world and the 9th largest in Africa. It sounds quite impressive. The coastline, by the way, is about 1,700 miles, which is large. And those figures sound impressive, but when you look at the continent of Africa, and you say that we are 700,000 square miles, the continent of Africa is 12 million square miles in area. So we're a tiny little speck at the bottom. However, we do punch very much above our weight. As I'm sure you've picked up in Daniel's presentation, we're a very complex society. And we have a number of different colors. People are still very much focused on color in South Africa, probably because of our history. So we have black people, white people, and people that you heard Daniel mention as the colored people, who are people of mixed race. And a big population, or percentage of our population, are colored people. And when you consider that it was illegal to have sexual relations between black and white, you've got to wonder where all these colored people came from. And we have black people are 81% of the total population. The whites, falling unfortunately, used to be about 10, 11, down now to about 7%. And the colored people that I've referred to, 9% and 3% of those people are Indian, or not of those people, but 3% are Indian. Religion is a big part of the culture of South Africa, and Christianity is by far the largest, over 80%. But many of those churches are what they call independent African churches. Although they are Christian, they are Pentecostal, and the traditional Christian churches like Roman Catholicism, Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist, and so on, are a very small percentage of that Christian. The largest church in Southern Africa, not in South Africa, in Southern Africa, is called the Zion Christian Church, the ZCC. They have, nobody knows the correct figure, but somewhere in the region of 6 million members of the total population of 60 million. So 10% of the population are ZCC members. Although they call themselves Zion Christian, their emblem is a star. Not the same as the Jewish star, but there are many parallels between the ZCC and the Jewish faith. The star is a normal sheriff's star that you in America would be more familiar with. They don't eat pork and they don't eat crustacea. And their headquarters are at a place called Moriah. And outside Jerusalem is Mount Moriah. So you have some strange connection with the Jewish faith. These people in South Africa speak 11 official languages. We actually have more than 11, which I'll explain to you. But we have Nguni and we have Sotho for the black people. There are two groups, Nguni and Sotho. The black people came down from the Niger and the Cameroon area between 200 and 1600 AD. And they came in two streams from the interior of the country. They came from the Great Lakes area. They came down into the interior and they became the Sotho-speaking people. And down the east coast, where we're going, are the Nguni-speaking people. The most dominant language in South Africa is Zulu. That is the biggest home language in South Africa. The biggest spoken language is, of course, English. And then the second biggest is Xhosa, spelled X-H-O-S-A, and pronounced Xhosa, as if you were riding a horse and you're going, in the side of your mouth. And Mr. Mandela, for example, is one of the Xhosa people. So if you can speak one of the Nguni languages, you can understand the others. Likewise with the Sotho languages. If you can speak one of the Sotho language, you can understand the others. So all you need to be able to do is to speak one of the languages from each of the groups, and then you can understand everybody. So that's the black people. Then we come to the whites. And you would have heard the term from Daniel, of course, of Afrikaans and English. I'm going to explain about that. Let's deal with the smaller group first. The 37% are the English speakers, like me. We're the descendants of the English. We are not English. We're English-speaking South Africans. We like the English over there. When we meet them on the rugby field, we hate them. But then we hate everybody on the rugby field. And so we are the smallest group. And the English came to Southern Africa finally in 1820, the first settlers. My family were with those first settlers. A lot of people think I was on those ships of 1820, but it's not true. The biggest language group are the Afrikaners. They speak the language of Afrikaans, and as Daniel told you, they are the descendants of the Dutch. And they have been here since 1652. And when they came to farm. They were brought out by the Dutch East India Company, and they came to farm. So the Dutch word for a farmer is a boer. They became known as the Boers. Whether they were farmers or not, they were always referred to as the Boers. But they are only the 11 of the official languages. The 12th language is the language of the taxis. That's a taxi. In South Africa, we have something like 40,000 taxis. Very few people use public transport. They use the taxis. Now, those taxis take 12, 14, 16 people, sometimes 20, sometimes 40, sometimes 60. One was stopped, and I have the newspaper cutting. 112 people got out of one of those taxis. You can look it up, you can Google it. Now, to call those taxis, it's not exactly the same as in New York. If you try to hail a taxi like that, which you wouldn't do because you would go by Uber or one of the other taxis, if you tried to hail a taxi like that, as you would in New York, he would pay absolutely no attention. You have to have the language of the taxis, and every place in every city has its own series of languages. For example, I can stand on the side of the road. If I want to go to the railway station, when I see one of those vehicles coming, I make the sign of a steam train. There's an area of Johannesburg called Four Ways. You hold up four fingers. There's an area of Johannesburg called Alexandra Township, which has a very poor reputation. You make the sign of a gun. There's an area of Johannesburg called Orange Farm. You hold the orange. And before you go anywhere or to a new town, you'll find out what the signs of the taxis are to the places that you want to go. Of course, these people that I'm talking about are not the original people of Southern Africa. The original people all came from that lady there. It's actually a man, but she's called Mrs. Pless. And she is the first Australopithecus africanus found outside Johannesburg in what today is called the cradle of mankind. In fact, there's a wonderful sign at the Apartheid Museum where you see that particular exhibit, and it says, "Welcome home." So I say to you all, welcome home, because you're coming home. Whether it was South Africa or somewhere else in Africa, but that is where man originated. And these people, or if Mrs. Pless, became the first upright being. So we went from all fours to walking. And then we evolved into people that we call the Bushmen. These are people known as the Khoi and the Khoisan. They were the original people of southern Africa. Not many of them left. Very primitive people, as you can see. They probably have been the worst treated of any of our people in southern Africa, arguably. If you see this, is how they look. She's probably only about 40 years old. Very wizened, can walk for days without water. And these are people that were referred to as the Bushmen. And here you see some paintings or some symbols, because those people who were first on all fours, then upright, and then they started to record their history by using symbols and illustrations on rock facings. So they became thinkers. They also spent a lot of time gazing at the planets, because before the white man came, they could tell you what the movements of the planets were. And so they became gazers. And these are some of the Khoi prisoners in the early 1700s in Cape Town. If you look at the man second from the end, you should see that he looks exactly like Nelson Mandela. The reason being, Nelson Mandela wasn't a Khoi, but he was a Xhosa. And there was much in the early years interbreeding between the Xhosa and the Khoi. I'm going to show you something which I think will shock you. What you're looking at here is a hunting license. Next door to South Africa is a country that was called today Namibia. It used to be German Southwest Africa, but South Africa occupied German Southwest Africa on behalf of England, or the Allies, in the First World War. And from 1918 right through to 1990, South Africa administered Southwest Africa. You could buy a license to hunt one of those people that I showed you, one of those people up to 1936 in Southwest Africa. And so we go back to the early people. We talk about the Dutch, and the English, but before them were the Portuguese. In the 1500s and onwards in Europe, there was a legend about a king called Prester John, who was somewhere in Africa, in a land of milk and honey, where the rivers were paved with gold. And the whole of Europe and the explorers were set on finding the land of Prester John. In 1486, the Portuguese sent a man called Bartholomew Dias to explore the route to the east. And Bartholomew Dias set off with 2 caravels of 50 tons to sail from Portugal around the Cape to find the sea route to India, and to see if he could find the lands of Prester John. Those ships, the caravels, were 50 tons. They had 170 men aboard. This ship is 32,000 tons. A little bit different to how they traveled. The crew slept on a common area. There was no ventilation. There was water slushing across the decks and the below decks. There was urine, feces. Ships took 4 months to come from Europe to the Cape. Many a ship was lost at sea because the crew died. And they had not the crew to raise the sails to float or to arrive in the Cape. When you consider how we travel today on this unbelievable ship, seaborne, and compare it with those people, it's just absolutely amazing as the changes that have happened. Bartholomew Dias set foot on southern African soil and killed a Khoi because down in the Cape there were no black people. They were all Khoi. He shot a Khoi with his crossbow, and that set the scene for the next few hundred years of violence in southern Africa. He was followed 10 years later, 1497, by a man called Vasco da Gama. And incidentally, both of these people brought prisoners with them. Bartholomew Dias brought 4 women who were dropped off at strategic places to go inland and report back if they found the lands of Prester John. Of course, they were never heard of again. Most of them, in fact, all 4, were negress prisoners who were dropped off by Bartholomew Dias. But Vasco da Gama followed in 1497, and he landed in Mossel Bay, up the coast of southern Africa, on the east coast, and again, there was violence, and Khoi were killed by the whites. And maybe that sort of set the pattern for what was to come. Of course, the Portuguese reported back that this place, the Cape of Storms as it was known, was extremely dangerous. But in 1503, a man called de Saldanha landed in Table Bay. And he named the bay Saldanha Bay. And it kept that name for 100 years. And then, 100 years later, it was changed to Table Bay, which it's known by today. And the town of Saldanha is about an hour and a half's drive from Cape Town on the west coast. So he was relegated to a minor town up the coast. In 1507, the king of Portugal decided that this place was actually too dangerous for Portuguese ships to land. And so he issued a decree that no Portuguese ships should actually land at the Cape. But in 1510, a man called D'Almeida, who had been the viceroy in India for Portugal, was on his way home. Picture the scene. Some of you would recognize what I'm going to say. He was at the end of his career, 60 years old. He was tired, and he wanted to retire. This was his last journey home. And they were forced to pull in at the Cape to replenish water. Well, some of the men went ashore and met up with the Khoi. And there was a friendly exchange between them. But suddenly things turned nasty. Nobody knows what really happened, but certain of those 12 were hit with sticks by the Khoi across the face and bloodied. They returned back to the ship. Now, picture the scene again. These are highly, highly sophisticated, civilized people, as we would say, the Portuguese, in armor, modern weapons, and here they were dealing with people who were covered in mud and clay and who stank. They had a few skins as well. Very primitive people in the minds of the Portuguese who looked down on the Khoi. And when these 12 men returned to the ship, their honor had obviously been bruised. And D'Almeida said, well, we've got to show who's the boss. So he took his 170 men off the ship to attack the Khoi. But as he rowed ashore, he said, being 62 and looking forward to retirement, whither do we go now? They landed on the shore, and the men moved towards the Khoi. There was a brief scuffle, and the Portuguese came away with the Khoi's cattle and abducted 4 children. Now, the cattle were not a problem. The reason why it wasn't a problem is the Khoi were so uncivilized that they could communicate with their cattle by whistles. And so they just called the cattle back. But then they gave a further whistle, and the cattle started to form a line and moved slowly and pushed the Portuguese soldiers, all 170 of them, onto the beach and into the shallow waters. Wearing armor, they were at an extreme disadvantage. Those cattle formed an impregnable wall behind which the Khoi killed them with fire-hardened sticks. In a short space of time, there were 72 of the 170 men who had been killed, including D'Almeida. And as D'Almeida died, his tutor heard that his protege was dying. He said, "I go to die at his side," which he did. The Khoi killed him as well. And that was the end of the Portuguese interest in the Cape. And as you know, they colonized Angola on the western side and Mozambique, which we will be passing if we're not already there. I doubt very much whether we are. But they ignored the Cape, known as the Cape of Storms. So not a lot happened, but then the English became interested in the Cape. And ships were passing around from Europe, Dutch ships, French ships, all going now to that gold mine of India, the spices. The English, in 14, decided that they needed a representative who would represent English interests in the Cape. So they abducted a Khoi man called Khoury and decided to teach him English and civilize him. They took Khoury and a friend of his onto the ship and then started to sail out of Table Bay. You saw that beautiful picture of the mountain. Can you imagine these 2 men who'd never been on a ship in their lives before, let alone been on one, they'd never seen one. And here they were on the ship being taken to England. And as that table disappeared below the horizon, the 2 men sobbed. And one of them, Khoury's colleague, died of a broken heart as they left. They took Khoury to London, to the home of Sir Thomas Smythe of the British East India Company, where he was paraded like some novelty. Khoury used to lie on the floor, crying, "Khoury, go home. Khoury, go home." The following year, they took him home, and he acted for the English. In some ways, it was their worst mistake, was to have civilized Khoury, as you can imagine. In 1620, Commander Fitzherbert and Commander Schilling arrived in a flotilla of English ships. And by chance, they heard that the Dutch were showing an interest in annexing the Cape. They decided to preempt the annexation. And so, early one morning in 1620, the full crew of the 2 ships were dressed in their finery and marched up what we call the rump of Lion's Head, part of Table Mountain. When they got to the top, watched by some wide-eyed Khoi, there was a formal ceremony of raising the cross of St. George. Trumpets blowing, drums rolling, and when it was all over, they lowered the cross of St. George and folded it ceremoniously, as I'm sure you've seen it happen in the movies, and presented it to the Khoi as a token of the day the English took their land. Ironically, the flagpole was erected next to a stone with the words VOC, or the letters VOC, for the Dutch East India Company on, indicating that the Dutch had in fact taken the Cape first. That was 1620. In 1652, or 1648 should I say, a ship called the Haarlem from Holland was wrecked in the Cape. And when the men went back to Holland, they said, this is a fine place. We should settle it. And the Dutch East India Company then sent out this man called Jan van Riebeck in 1652. And he became the first of the settlers. Jan van Riebeck and the people from the Dutch East India Company, as I said earlier, they came to farm and were known as the Boers. And as Daniel told you, they didn't like being told what to do. They were very independent-minded people. And the company told them what price they could sell their produce at and who they could deal with. It got too much for them. So they started to move away from the Cape. And you'll see those arrows indicate the directions that they moved. And those people became known as the Trek Boers. Trek meaning pull, and Boer meaning farmer. The farmers who pulled away. And they settled mainly on a river called the Fish River in the Eastern Cape. Their living conditions were hellish, very primitive. They lived like the Khoi. They wore skins, they were rough, tough, and in certain ways almost identical to the Khoi. In 1820, the British came, the first British settlers, and we're going to talk about that in one of my talks to come. The first British settlers came, and they had a big problem, the British. They had to have people who could speak English. They had taken over the Cape in 1806. In 1815, it became known as the Cape Colony, under British control. And these Boers, those that lived down in the Cape, not the Trek Boers, but everybody, they became disgruntled with British control. And in 1834, when the British did away with slavery, these people started the migration, as Daniel told you, of the Great Trek, moving into the interior with absolutely no idea of what lay ahead and what problems they would encounter. Conflict with tribes as they went, no knowledge of the interior of the country. And we're going to talk about the Great Trek in more detail in one of my talks still to come. They moved up into the interior, and in 1852, the British gave them the land. At the top there, you'll see the Transvaal, or the South African Republic, and that is the land that was given to the British, given by the British in 1852. You have to ask yourself the question, how come the British could give away the land? Did they occupy it? No, they didn't. It was a bit like selling Brooklyn Bridge. You can have that land over there, get out of our hair. So once they crossed a river called the Orange River, you'll see the Orange Free State. Once they moved from the Cape into what is designated there as the Orange Free State, they were free from British control. And there's stories of women crossing on rafts. And when they get to the banks on the other side, shouting, we're free, free at last from British control. What Daniel was explaining to you. And so they formed these independent republics. Eventually in 1852, the South African Republic, the one at the top, which is light orange, and 2 years later, 1854, the Orange Free State, two independent Boer republics. And here on the right, you'll see Natal, and Natal is in fact British colony. And down at the Cape Colony. So you have two independent British colonies, and you have two independent Boer republics. But the British, having given them the land in 1852, haven't taken into account what is under the land. And what is under the land, of course, is diamonds. And so Diamonds are discovered in 1868 in a place called Hopetown. And the land that it's discovered on doesn't belong to the Boers, it doesn't belong to the British, it belongs to people who are colored people called the Griquas. And the Griquas own the land. But everybody wants the land that the diamond's on. And so the British, being very smart, say to the other parties, listen, we should set up a commission of inquiry. Oh, we've learned so well. We have commissions of inquiry regularly called in South Africa today because you can waste a lot of time and actually get nowhere with a commission of inquiry. We'll set up the Keat Commission to decide who really owns the land. And then they went behind the Boers' backs to the Griqua and they said, listen, if the commission finds in your favor, we're more than happy to administer that territory for you. The Griquas say, thank you, sir. Well, that's exactly what happens. And the British annex that area and it becomes part of the Cape Colony. And so the British have the diamonds. And that is in 1868 and 1871 is the Keat Commission. So they've got the diamonds, but now we see the British start to flex their muscles. Diamonds become important to them. And they've given the Boers the Transvaal or the South African Republic. But in 1877, having given it to them, the British decide that the Boers are in fact incapable of administering the South African Republic responsibly. And so a man called Ryder Haggard runs the flag up on behalf of Great Britain in Pretoria in 1877. It takes the Boers 3 years to work out that they've lost their capital. I'm being facetious. 3 years later, on a day which is hallowed in Afrikaner history, the 16th of December of 1880, they declare war against Great Britain. Well, this is the last of the fine wars, if there's ever such a thing. There are 3 battles, major battles, and the Boers win them all. The Boers can do 3 things well. They can ride horses, they can shoot, and they can pray. And they had a secret weapon that goes through their whole history, which Daniel referred to. God is on our side. They win the war. And the English say, listen, too much. You take it back, and you can have your independence back. And so the Boers get back their beloved South African Republic. And that's in 1881. And then the event that shakes the world and the effects of which are felt today, the discovery of gold in 1886 in my city, Johannesburg. What do you think happens with the discovery of gold is people flock there, mainly from Europe and mainly from England. The Boers, who control the South African Republic under their president, a man called President Paul Kruger, feel threatened. All these English people coming in, and of course, the only people who had the vote in those days were the Afrikaners. They don't give these new people the vote. They call them the Uitlanders. And so tension builds up between the Uitlanders, the foreigners, the English speakers, Johannesburg and Pretoria. Johannesburg, very much English speaking. Pretoria, very Afrikaans. Only 25 miles apart. But the tension builds between the two. And in 1895, that man that you saw straddling the continent of Africa, Cecil John Rhodes, who has a lot to answer for, decides to stage an event which becomes known as the Jameson Raid. It's an attempt to take over the gold mines and the Republic, the Transvaal or the South African Republic. Both names are used, in case you're confused. He organizes his doctor, a man called Leander Starr Jameson, to march down from a place called Pitsani in Botswana. Not quite, but it came a little bit earlier in that first war. That first war that I referred to, incidentally, was the first South African war. It used to be called the First Boer War. Nowadays, we don't say the Boer War because that implies that black people were not involved. They were very involved. More than 20,000 black people died in that war. And so Pretoria and Johannesburg are at odds with each other. And Jameson comes down from Pitsani in the hope that the mine owners will join the local people and overthrow the Boer government. It's a total disaster. It's a story on its own, and we don't have time today. But the Jameson raid was really the prelude to what was to come. And England started to demand. The lady asked me the question, what was the cause of the war that followed? England began to interfere in the affairs of the South African Republic, telling them that they had to give the English settlers the vote. And they threatened the South African Republic. Eventually, tensions grew up to such a point that on the 11th of October of 1899, these Boers, 60,000 of them, declared war against the strongest military nation in the world. You have to be smoking something quite strong when you have no army and you declare war against the strongest military nation in the world. The English called it the Tea Time War. It'll be over by tea time. The generals in England slapped their legs in mirth and said, what a joke. They've dared to declare war on us. Well, those 60,000 farmers held out for 3 years. Not only did they hold out, but in the beginning, they were winning that war. And they invaded Natal, and they would have gone all the way through to Durban, and the war would have been over. But the General Jabir, in typical fashion of the Boers, said, when the Lord holds out his finger, you don't take his whole hand. And so they didn't. And as a consequence, the war went on for 3 years. And it was a very, very bitter war. When I grew up in a small town. It's called Mthatha. There was 2 schools in that town. One was English, one was Afrikaans. Now, rugby, as you're going to learn when you get to South Africa, is not considered a sport in South Africa. It's a religion. And I used to play, don't laugh, I used to play rugby for my school. I was actually quite good. Once a year, that town would come to a halt. Everybody in the town, and we're talking about the 50s here, 1950s, everybody in the town would come to watch the big game. And the big game was when we played rugby against the Afrikaans school. They didn't come to watch rugby. They came to join in a spectacle of violence. Before the game, their families would say, hit them, they're English. Our families would say, hit them, they're Afrikaners. We didn't know quite why we were having to hit them, but we did. The Afrikaners knew exactly why. Because they'd been taught it every day of their lives. Because I was English, we were not taught the details. And the details of the war are what created the bitterness. The British, during that war, started a campaign of burning the farms of the Boers. They burned down 35,000 farms. And just in case any of you think I'm biased, my family fought on the side of the English. 35,000 farms and something like 28 whole towns were destroyed by the British. They killed their cattle. They shot them. They killed their sheep. and they blasted the farms with dynamite and burnt them down. And then they took the people that were on those farms and took them by train to what Daniel referred to as internment camps. The British called them places of safety. The Afrikaner calls them concentration camps to this day. 29,000 people were put into the camps. 27,000 were women and children, and 25,000 were under the age of 15 years. A whole generation of the Afrikaners was wiped out. And that set the scene for what was to come. These people were totally destroyed. I'm going to tell you a story, just to end, to illustrate this war, if I may. And I've got to translate a couple of words which you might not be familiar with. In Afrikaans, if I say the word oom, O-O-M, it means uncle. A dum-dum bullet is a bullet which has been specially marked and which creates a normal hole on entry and a big hole on exit. Considered unethical in any kind of warfare, even to this day. It's in the Geneva Convention. And khaki, Americans call it khaki, is this color. It's the color of the British soldiers' uniform, and they were referred to as the khakis. And bear in mind when I tell you the story, these are highly religious people, very devout Calvinists. And the story is about two Boers in the war, Oom Skalk and his nephew Hannes. And it goes like this. English people are queer, you know. Take that day my nephew Hannes and I were outside a small town called De Wetsdorp. We were waiting for the damn car keys to come. Hannes was whiling away the time by rubbing a bullet on a rock to turn it into a dum-dum bullet. I looked at him and I said, Hannes, what you're doing is very wrong, you know. The Lord is watching you. He won't like what you're doing. Ach, Oom Skalk, he said as he carried on rubbing the bullet on the rock. The Lord knows this is the Boer War and there's so many of those damn English. He wouldn't mind a dum-dum bullet or two, I'm sure. I tended to agree with him, so I let him be. And he carried on rubbing the bullet on the rock while I peered down the track through the heat haze. Presently, my patience was rewarded. I saw two horsemen approaching. They were English soldiers, all right, riding well-fed horses, lovely shiny brown boots, khaki uniforms. Hell, I was glad I was behind a rock and they couldn't see me in my worn-out old boots and my trousers that were tattered and torn, and particularly my shirt, which was torn from the collar right down to the tail, where I'd been snagged on a barbed wire fence a few days earlier, running away from the British. My felt cornet, who was a fat man, wasn't quite so lucky. He ended up on the wire with a bullet through him. You know, throughout the whole of the war, I was glad that I didn't have corns and that I was thin. Hannes and I fired at the same moment. A bullet struck the same soldier. He twisted in the saddle and he fell to the ground and lay still in a cloud of dust. His companion looked around, trying to establish where we lay. And then, without any thought for his own safety, he climbed off his horse, walked around, and single-handedly lifted up the body of his companion and put him into the saddle. That is no mean feat for a man to lift the dead weight of another, I can tell you. And then he turned around and walked to his horse, took the bridle, and climbed in and took his companion's bridle, and then waved, looking directly at where I did lay, as if challenging me to shoot again. I can tell you I needed no further encouragement. I slammed another bullet into my Martini Henry. I lifted up my rifle and I had him in my sights. And I was just squeezing the trigger when the barrel was pushed down. I looked to my left. It was Hannes who'd pushed it down. His face was white. He said, "Don't shoot, Oom Skalk. That is a brave man." Now I knew not only were the English queer, but so was Hannes. I mean, why not shoot a man if he's brave? Particularly if he's on the other side. Well, Hannes and I were together for another 3 months. And then Hannes was taken prisoner by the English next to the Vaal River. What do you think happened when they took him prisoner? They searched him. They found the dum-dum bullets. They shot him for that. You see, what Hannes never fully understood, even if the Lord did forgive him, the English certainly wouldn't. At the end of the war, my wife and I returned to where our farm had been. All we could recognize the farm by was the quarry up on the hill where we used to quarry the slate for the cattle kraal. Our miles and miles of corn had been burnt to the ground. It was now just black stubble. Our cattle and sheep had been shot, and they left the carcasses there in the hot summer sun, with flies buzzing around and the sky speckled with vultures as they circled above. The stench was ghastly. They'd taken all of our worldly possessions out of our home before burning it to the ground. We had nothing left. We had nothing left. My wife had gone into the concentration camp with our 5 daughters. She came out alone. When I looked at her face and I saw the pain and suffering and how she had changed after what she had gone through, I knew that I, Oomskalk, had been through 3 years of that hellish war, had in fact not seen the war at all. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.